Welcome to the debate. Today we are asking a question that, frankly, it breaks the fundamental rules of modern science,
Yeah, it really does.
right? It's a question drawn directly from Steafon Perry's 2026 book, The Matrix of Existence. And we are basically asking, does the physical and empirical data of our reality actually point to a vacuum-expanding universe governed by a standard cosmological model?
Or does it describe something entirely different, like a bounded, stationary, living biological organism? What Perry actually calls a living field.
Exactly.
And, what makes Perry's text so provocative isn't just the sheer scale of that question. It's the really rigorous evidence tier rubric he uses to force us to look at it.
The Tier 1 versus Tier 5 distinction.
Right. He strictly separates Tier 1 data, which is observable, empirical facts, things like declassified government documents, peer-reviewed acoustics, and oceanographic measurements. He separates that from Tier 5 data, which is just theoretical synthesis.
And by drawing that hard line, he really forces us to confront how much of modern cosmology actually relies on unobservable placeholders.
Exactly. So what's your baseline take on this?
Well, I will lay my perspective out right from the start. I argue that Perry's living field model takes those Tier 1 physical anomalies, everything from standing wave acoustics to military navigation protocols, and synthesizes them.
Synthesizes them into something better?
Yeah, into a more elegant, coherent structure than the standard model currently can.
Well, and my perspective is that while the Tier 1 anomalies Perry cites are entirely real and they do demand rigorous scientific scrutiny, his Tier 5 leap fundamentally conflates biological metaphors with cosmological reality.
You think he's pushing the metaphor too far?
I do. The standard model can explain these physical phenomena without requiring us to believe we live inside an enclosed, stationary dome.
I see. Well, to really get into this, we have to start with the foundation of Perry's critique. He calls it the parity argument.
Right, the dark matter issue.
Exactly. So the standard model of cosmology demands that we accept roughly 95% of our universe is composed of dark matter and dark energy.
Right, the invisible scaffolding of the universe.
Exactly. But let's be clear about what that scaffolding actually is. I mean, these are completely unobservable placeholders. If you look at why they were introduced, it's because astrophysicists realized that galaxies were spinning so fast they should be flying apart.
The math wasn't working.
Right. The mathematical equations of a vacuum-expanding universe basically broke. So to fix the math, they wrote in invisible mass and invisible energy that we have never directly detected. Perry's model completely removes those ghosts.
He replaces them with something else, though.
He does. He replaces them with a stationary substrate and a conscious ether.
Meaning the Earth isn't moving through a vacuum, but rather sits stationary within a bounded field?
Yes. And he uses that stationary substrate to explain highly documented Tier 1 data, like the famous Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887.
Yes.
For those who weren't familiar, Michelson and Morley built this incredibly sensitive interferometer to measure the drag of the Earth moving through the luminiferous ether of space.
Right. They expected to measure the shift.
Exactly. They expected to see light shift as the Earth hurled through this medium. But they got a no result. They detected absolutely no movement. Now, I see why you think that the standard model is the safest bet given its massive institutional backing. But let me give you a different perspective.
Go ahead.
When you strip away the institutional dogma, Perry's architecture of a bounded womb requires far fewer invisible, unprovable variables to make the physics work. It's just, it's a cleaner equation.
I come at it from a different way. First, I have a profound respect for intellectual humility in science, and I deeply appreciate Perry's evidence tier rubric.
It is very thorough.
It is, and you're right. The Michelson-Morley null result happened. The Tier 1 data he brings up is real data. But Perry makes a fundamental category mistake here.
How so?
Well, he observes a biological imperative, the fact that life requires a boundary. A cell needs a physical lipid membrane to keep its cytoplasm intact. A developing fetus needs a uterine wall.
Right.
He takes that biological necessity and projects it onto astrophysics. He assumes the universe must operate like a giant cell.
But isn't that just observing fractal patterns in nature?
It's forcing a metaphor where it doesn't belong. I mean, the standard model, supported by the realities of evolutionary biology and macroscale orbital mechanics, it already accounts for these phenomena.
You don't think we need the boundary?
No, we don't need to conjure a rigid physical dome or a literally stationary Earth to explain why life thrives here. Biological evolution adapted to the physics of the universe. The universe wasn't built as a biological terrarium to house us.
Well, if you're listening to this right now, you might be rolling your eyes at the idea of a stationary Earth.
I'm sure a few people are.
Right. We've all grown up with the globe. But stick with us here, because we have to look at how we actually calculate movement across this Earth. This is where the standard model's map severely diverges from the literal territory.
You're talking about Chapter 3?
Yes. In Chapter 3, Perry dives into declassified U.S. Army Research Laboratory documents, specifically ARLTR 2352 and ARLTR 5118.
The Artillery and Electromagnetic Propagation Manuals.
Right. When the military needs to calculate highly precise electromagnetic signal propagation or long-range ballistic projectiles over hundreds of miles, they don't use spherical geometry.
No, they don't.
They default to a flat, non-rotating Earth as their operative substrate. Let's break down why that's bizarre under the standard model. Over a 100-mile range, spherical math dictates a curvature drop of roughly 6,600 feet.
That's a significant drop.
It is. If the Earth were a spinning globe, a radar signal, or a projectile that ignores that curvature, while also ignoring a 1,000-mile-per-hour equatorial rotation, it would miss its target catastrophically. The Coriolis effect alone should throw everything off, but it doesn't.
But they are doing that for computational ease.
If you're firing a highly precise weapon, you don't use easy math if it means you miss. They calculate as if the substrate is stationary, because the reality they are interacting with behaves as if it is stationary.
I disagree with the premise there.
Well, look at the Haversine formula, which is basically the complex spherical math commercial navigation uses to calculate a curved path over a globe. Perry treats it as just a coordinate overlay. It's a mathematical interface. It's a map, not the literal territory. Which brings up Perry's aquarium analogy.
Right, the idea that we're on the inside looking in?
Exactly. Look at every single environment we know of that sustains life. A single cell, a mother's womb, a pressurized terrarium, an aquarium.
They all have boundaries.
In every observable case, life is held on the inside of a pressurized containing boundary. Why do we assume, against all of our biological observations, that we are the one anomaly clinging to the outside of a spinning ball in a chaotic, infinitely expanding vacuum?
Because the physics of gravity and mass demand it. Look, you're taking the concept of aquarium glass and scaling it up to planetary proportions, but you aren't accounting for the sheer mechanics of how matter coalesces.
But what about the ARL documents?
To address the ARL documents, that is a massive mischaracterization of engineering pragmatism. Yes, those documents use a flat Earth non-rotating assumption, but we have to explain why they do that.
To hit the target?
Yes, but engineers use flat plane mathematics as what's called a local tangent plane approximation.
A local tangent plane.
Right. At localized scales, even 100 miles, treating the Earth as a flat plane works perfectly fine for the computer. When a system is processing real-time telemetry, forcing the computer to constantly calculate spherical harmonics and complex Coriolis vectors introduces massive computational latency.
It slows it down.
Exactly. It slows the targeting computer down. For line-of-sight or localized ballistic arcs, you just don't need that level of processing. A mathematical interface used to save computer processing power does not equal a literal, physical stationary plane.
I concede that at a local level, dropping variables saves processing time. But if the variables are real, dropping them over 100 miles should still result in an error.
Not an error large enough to matter for the specific localized task. But if you want to talk about macro scales, how do you account for the Artemis II lunar trajectory?
That's a fair question.
We send crewed spacecraft to the moon and back. The math required to hit a moving target from an Earth spinning at 1,000 miles per hour, orbiting the sun at 67,000 miles per hour, while the moon itself is orbiting the Earth.
It's complex, yes.
It is compounding macro-scale orbital mechanics. You absolutely cannot fake that with a flat, stationary disk.
Well, I will be the first to admit that the compounding velocities of the Artemis II math are incredibly daunting to parse. But Perry argues that orbital mechanics is essentially just another coordinate translation layer.
Another overlay?
Yeah. It's a mathematical system that produces consistent results within its own closed system. It proves the math works, but it doesn't offer proof of literal physical motion through a vacuum.
That's a convenient workaround.
Maybe. But rather than getting stuck on navigation software, let's look at the physical boundaries required by acoustic physics.
You mean the Schumann Resonance?
Yes. Let's transition from the mathematical boundaries of navigation to actual measurable wave mechanics, the 7.83 Hertz Schumann Resonance.
The heartbeat of the Earth, as it's often called.
Exactly. For the listener, this is effectively the electromagnetic heartbeat of our environment. Lightning strikes all over the Earth create electromagnetic waves that get trapped between the Earth's surface and the upper atmosphere, pulsing at a baseline of 7.83 Hertz.
Which is a standing wave.
Right. Now, in classical physics, a standing wave like the Schumann resonance requires fixed boundaries to fold back on itself.
Right. It needs a cavity to resonate inside.
Exactly. Perry uses the guitar body analogy. The specific note an acoustic guitar produces is dictated strictly by the rigid, fixed wooden cavity of the instrument.
Because the sound waves bounce.
Yes, if you pluck a string, the sound waves bounce off the rigid walls. If the guitar were made of flexible, warping plastic, or if it suddenly changed size, the note would constantly shift and smear. It wouldn't hold a tune.
Okay, but the atmosphere is in a wooden box.
Which is exactly Perry's point regarding the 2003 Halloween solar storms.
Ah, the solar flares?
This was a massive Class X solar flare event. The Earth's ionosphere was absolutely bombarded by plasma. Because of this, the lower boundary of the ionosphere, the supposed roof of our acoustic cavity, compressed dramatically.
It dropped significantly.
It dropped from about 60 kilometers high down to 40 kilometers on the sun-facing side of the Earth.
It's a massive geometric deformation.
I mean, it was a deformation of tens of thousands of meters. And yet, the Schumann harmonic series remained perfectly stable. The baseline frequency didn't split.
The harmonics held.
The harmonic ratios didn't smear at all. If our acoustic cavity is just a flexible plasma layer or a magnetic bubble, it simply cannot hold a clean, static acoustic fingerprint under that kind of violent deformation.
So you're saying it needs a wall?
It requires a rigid physical dome underneath that plasma, a firmament. The acoustic data demands a fixed wall to bounce off of.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Okay, go ahead.
You are demanding absolute rigid mechanics, where fluid dynamics and statistical averaging are actually at play. You're using the guitar analogy, but a guitar is an empty box.
And the atmosphere isn't.
No, the space between the Earth and the ionosphere isn't empty. It's filled with complex fluids and atmospheric layers that act more like a shock absorber than a rigid piece of wood.
We need definitional precision here.
What part needs precision?
The idea that the frequency is a perfectly static, unbreakable note. The ionosphere does fluctuate and the frequency does change.
Slightly, yes.
In fact, geophysicists measure diurnal frequency drifts constantly. The Schumann resonance shifts by about 0.05 Hertz between day and night simply due to solar radiation changing the plasma density. It is not a perfectly static 7.83 Hertz.
But 0.05 Hertz is a microscopic shift given the scale of the 2003 compression.
Right. And the reason the 2003 Halloween storm didn't shatter the harmonic fingerprint entirely is due to a mechanism called global cavity averaging.
Okay, explain that. The cavity between the Earth and the ionosphere in a global resonant chamber. A localized plasma compression on the sun-facing side of the Earth makes the cavity smaller there, yes? But mathematically, that compression is smoothed out by the expanded, unaffected cavity on the night-facing side.
So it balances out.
The waves integrate globally over the entire sphere. You do not need a rigid physical glass dome to maintain a resonant average in a closed electromagnetic circuit. The plasma boundary works perfectly fine if you do the global math.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Global cavity averaging is a statistical abstraction. It's a mathematical smoothing argument, not a physical one.
It describes physical reality, though.
But if you have a severe geometric asymmetric asymmetry in a resonant cavity, like a 20-kilometer drop in the ceiling, Classical acoustic physics dictates you should see harmonic smearing, even if the average remains the same.
I disagree, but continue.
The clarity of the signal points toward a primary boundary that didn't move, regardless of what the plasma below it was doing. But let's move from the structure of the cavity to the inhabitants. Let's look at why that specific 7.83 Hertz frequency matters, because this is where the physical architecture meets human biology. Why does this exact frequency tether to us?
I can answer that immediately through evolutionary biology.
You're going to say passive adaptation.
Yes, because it perfectly explains the data. The human brain operates at various wave states. The theta-alpha threshold, which is the state of consciousness hovering right between deep relaxation and wakefulness, it sits exactly at 7.83 Hertz.
A perfect match.
Exactly. Now Perry looks at this matching frequency and sees a grand design. He sees a literal womb calibrated for the human soul. But I just see passive adaptation.
How so?
The human nervous system evolved over millions of years inside the electromagnetic environment of this planet. The Schumann Resonance has been a constant background frequency that entire time.
So we just tuned to it?
Naturally. Through natural selection, our brains calibrated to the ambient electromagnetic environment to optimize survival. It's not a cosmic specification, it's just a biological organism adapting to its local environment.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because passive adaptation only explains survival. It explains a biological receiver.
Which is what we are.
But it does not explain a transmitter, and it certainly does not explain an active navigator. If we were just passively adapting, we would just absorb the field. But look at the HeartMath Institute's peer-reviewed data.
The heart field studies.
Yes. The human heart doesn't just passively endure this field. It broadcasts a coherent electromagnetic field several feet outward that actually interacts with the Earth's field. But more importantly, we need to talk about the CIA's 1983 Gateway Process Report, authored by Army Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDonald.
Right, this is where Perry gets into the Monroe Institute's hemisync research.
Yes. The military analyzed the Monroe Institute's hemisync audio technology. For the listener, hemisync works by playing two slightly different audio frequencies into each ear.
Like a binaural beat.
Exactly. Say 100 hertz in the left ear and 104 hertz in the right. The brain compensates by creating a third phantom beat inside your head at exactly 4 hertz. It forces the left and right hemispheres of the brain to synchronize.
Which alters the state of consciousness.
Exactly. But McDonald's report showed that when participants achieved this hemispheric coherence, they didn't just relax. The filtering mechanisms of the ordinary waking state dropped away entirely.
They accessed something else.
These subjects turned into active navigators of an informational substrate. They were accessing structured, non-local information. It's what the ancients called the Akashic record and what Perry calls the living field.
I mean, I will admit, McDonald's findings are, they're profound and frankly, a bit spooky to read.
Because it defies the passive adaptation argument. Evolution does not produce a highly sophisticated active navigational capability that far exceeds the basic requirements of avoiding predators and finding food.
You think it implies design?
Natural selection produces exactly what survival requires and absolutely nothing more. The human capacity to physically tune our brains to read the universe's informational substrate implies that the substrate was specifically designed to be read.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the massive leap you're making to tie that back to cosmology?
It seems like a logical next step.
I don't dismiss McDonald's findings. The neuroscience of hemispheric synchronization is fascinating, and altered states of consciousness reveal incredible things about human cognition and our connection to reality.
Right.
But you cannot use the fact that the brain is a sophisticated receiver of non-local information to prove that the boundary of the physical universe is a literal stationary dome.
Why not? If the brain is tuning into the field, the mechanics of the field matter.
Because you are taking a metaphysical experience, the gateway participants accessing the absolute or the Akashic record, and using it to claim that the Antarctic circumpolar current is literally functioning as a cellular membrane holding in the cytoplasm of a flat Earth.
That's Perry's synthesis.
And it is the ultimate category mistake. The brain might be a highly tuned antenna, yes, but an antenna works on a spinning globe hurtling through a vacuum just as well as it works inside a pressurized terrarium.
Does it, though?
You can have a radio receiver turned on inside a moving car. You don't need the car to be parked in a garage to pick up the signal.
But does it work just as well, though? If the Earth is spinning at 1,000 miles an hour and hurtling through a galaxy at 500,000 miles an hour, the electromagnetic tether between our biology and the planet's field would logically be subjected to massive frequency drift.
Not if the entire system is moving together.
But look at the alignment of the data. The military requires a stationary substrate for precision ballistics. The acoustic physics requires a rigid boundary to maintain the standing Schumann wave without smearing.
Again, local approximations and global averaging.
And our consciousness requires a stable, tuned carrier frequency to actively access the living field. Perry's model takes acoustics, oceanography like the Antarctic boundary regulating thermal and electrical pressure, just like a cell membrane, and consciousness, and unifies them into a single, coherent, designed organism.
It's a grand unifying theory.
It completely replaces the dead machine of the standard model with a living incubator.
And my summary position remains that layering ancient womb cosmology over modern physics risks replacing one set of dogma with another.
Even if the data points there?
The Tier 1 anomalies Perry highlights are incredibly valuable. The localized flat-plane military calculations, the precise tuning of the Schumann resonance, the mysteries of human consciousness explored in the gateway process. These absolutely demand deeper scientific inquiry.
We agree on that.
We have glaring blind spots in the standard cosmological model. Dark matter is a massive blind spot, but declaring that the Earth is a literal, stationary incubator enclosed in a physical firmament discards centuries of verifiable astrophysics.
I see that as a necessary paradigm shift.
We can deeply acknowledge the profound interconnectedness of life and the cosmos without enclosing ourselves in a literal glass terrarium.
Yet, even in our strong disagreement over the literal geometry of the universe, there is a powerful point of convergence here.
I think so, yes.
Both of us, looking at the exact same source material, agree that the machine metaphor of the universe is utterly dead.
Absolutely. The 19th century idea that we are just isolated biological accidents moving through a cold, indifferent vacuum, it just doesn't hold up to the data anymore.
No, it doesn't.
Whether the living field is literal, as Perry argues and you support, or whether it's metaphorical, as I argue, reality behaves much more like a connected, responsive network than an empty room.
Exactly. It's a field where our consciousness actually plays an active role, where our biological frequencies are intimately tied to the planet's frequencies.
It's a participatory universe.
If you're listening to this and you want to dig deeper into how the physics and the consciousness research connect, I highly recommend diving back into the source material. Look specifically at Perry's sections on the holographic principle to explore how the complex information of a 3D reality might actually be encoded on a 2D boundary and form your own conclusions.
It is rigorous, fascinating material. Even if you ultimately reject the enclosed geometric conclusions, as I do, Perry forces you to actually defend your assumptions rather than just accepting the consensus.
And that is the ultimate value of this kind of discourse. At the start of our conversation, we asked if we've been looking at the universe like engineers trying to read a cold, mechanical blueprint, rather than physicians examining a living anatomy chart.
And maybe we have been.
Perhaps the truth is that the blueprint was actually alive all along.
A living anatomy. It really does change how you look at the sky.
It changes everything.